This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I am delighted to welcome back to the show Clark Collis, who was formerly of Entertainment Weekly, is now a freelancer, and has written a follow-up to his Making of Shaun of the Dead book, You've Got Some Red on You, with a kind of contemporary history of the recent wave of horror and the takeover horror has had of the movie industry to some degree. Screaming and Conjuring is the name of his book. The resurrection and unstoppable rise of the modern horror movie. Thank you for joining me, Clark.
I'm absolutely delighted. Thank you so much for asking me.
And I mean, it says everything in that subtitle, really, doesn't it? The resurrection and unstoppable rise of the modern horror movie. Because, you know, we've all had the moans and groans about superhero movies. But if you sort of look away from tentpole blockbuster and you look at the actual ratio of who's making money out of sort of the lower to mid to lower budget films, then it's really the horror movies which are capable of still doing that.
Absolutely. And I have to say, in the 2 or 3 years it's taken me to write this book, that has only become more and more true. I mean, I think if I'd come up with that subtitle, the resurrection and unstoppable rise of the horror movie 3 years ago, I might have thought, I mean, it's sort of true, but like 3 years on, it really does seem like horror is, the one thing, well, not the one thing, but one of the very, very few things that people will now come out to see. I mean, my book essentially covers the years from the period from 1996, when the first Scream film came out, to 2013, when the first Conjuring film came out. But I also, in a sort of a lengthy epilogue, cover the last 10 or 12 years. And this year alone, I mean, you've had Sinners, you've had Final Destination Bloodlines, which was a huge hit, for a film that's like the sixth entry in a horror franchise. As we speak, Weapons is the number one movie in America. It's quite astounding, really. I mean, I remember seeing some when I was a kid, when I was at college. I remember watching some show, and it was one of those sort of like Channel 4 shows that was on a Sunday morning. It was like a magazine show, and they did a thing on horror movies. And at the bottom, I think they had a little running ticker, and there was this sort of fact, quote unquote, where it said that no horror film has ever lost money. And I'm not sure that's entirely true. I could maybe name a couple that might have lost money. But I remember thinking at the time, why do they make anything else? Like, why, if you're selling a series of products, one of which always makes money and the others, sometimes they make money and sometimes they don't, why do they do anything else? And over the last 3 years, I've actually become horrified by that prospect, ironically, that I'm horrified that one day I'm going to wake up and Warner Brothers or Paramount are going to, not that it's very likely, are going to announce from now on it's all horror movies. We're not doing we're not gambling our money with anything else. But when you look at, the box office results of the last couple of years, yeah, there's no doubt that again and again with Barbarian and Smile, so many movies, 28 years later this year, again and again, horror has turned a profit. And it's interesting you talk about the superhero phenomenon, because one of the sort of subplots of my book is that, traditionally it has often been people who made their Hollywood bones in horror movies that have been entrusted uh, with superhero tales. I mean, the most obvious early example being Sam Raimi, who obviously made the Evil Dead films, and then a trilogy of beloved and hugely successful Spider-Man films. And in the course of my book, you have James Gunn, Zack Snyder and James Gunn, who together made the Dawn of the Dead remake. Then Zack Snyder takes over the DC universe. Then James Gunn takes it over from him. Scott Derrickson, whose first film was a Hellraiser movie, although he prefers to actually say his first film was something else because it wasn't theatrically released, and he's not overly thrilled about that movie. But Scott Derrickson started off in, then goes on to Doctor Strangelove, and again, this happens, and so horror creators, horror directors create this superhero universe, and then what's interesting is that when the whole thing starts to crumble, they all sort of, I don't mean to say they slink back to horror, but they certainly return to horror. Scott Derrickson comes back and to horror films. Zack Snyder makes a zombie film. It's just it's just an interesting sort of subplot that the architects, some of the prime architects of the superhero, the success of the superhero genre have been these horror directors who then actually, when it all starts to fall apart, go back to horror, who welcome them with the horror community welcomes them with open arms.
Peter Jackson as well. Lord of the Rings is one of the most popular franchises ever, and starts with Bad Taste and Brain Dead and Meet the Feebles, Meet the Feebles is just so good. If you've never seen that, dear listener, you're in for a sick treat.
Well, I have to say, Peter Jackson, much like I'm still waiting for James Cameron to go back to making killer robot movies. I've now been someone who watched Brain Dead again and again when I was at college. I've waited a long time for Peter Jackson to go back to making what I think he does the best, despite the huge success of the Lord of the Rings movies. And he has talked about it from time to time. But I think it is difficult for people who've been operating at that sort of level to go back and make, anything, even a moderately cheap horror movie. Although, having said which, James Wan, between making Aquaman and Aquaman 2, made Malignant, which is, it's not that cheap, but it's nasty as hell. And because it came out during COVID, we got lost in the shuffle a bit. But to go from, he loves horror, but to go from Aquaman to sort of clear your palate with a film about a woman who's got a psychotic tumor living in the back of her brain is quite a move, and I applaud him for it.
It's funny as well that the sort of online horror community, I always feel they're very, very defensive of horror, and they're very, especially the prestige of horror. And, we don't get enough Oscars, and we don't get enough awards, and we don't even get nominated for some of these things. And as a big horror fan myself, I always think this is a real misdirected ambition. You don't want to be respectable, surely.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I worked at Entertainment Weekly for 18 years, and so many media outlets, Entertainment Weekly was obsessed with the Oscars and award season, and that's fine, and people are interested in it, but that was definitely something that I had to kind of gear myself up to write about, because it's not like a sport. It's weird because people are obsessed with who's going to win an Oscar, and then the minute the Oscars are over, everybody talks about how wrong-headed the decisions were. And it's like, I don't understand. I just don't understand the point of this, really, especially now in a period. I guess it does help advertise, publicize some movies like Anora. But, I'm old enough to remember that a film would win an Oscar and then would become a success afterwards, or, because it would still be in theaters. And I guess that's true to some extent with streaming and etc. now. But no, I agree. I mean, I agree, but then sometimes I'll sit around and think, oh, so and so should have won an Oscar for, this or that, or, I'll sort of, mentally fulminate. But yeah, it's not something that I lose. It's not something that I lose much sleep over. I mean, like I said, the Oscars seem to me more wrong than right half the time. So it really doesn't trouble me.
Yeah, the wrongness is in the DNA from the very beginning. At the start of your book, there is a real sense of, I mean, it's difficult with any history of where to start with anything, but it was interesting, particularly with your book, that you're starting with Scream, and Scream, of course, is by Wes Craven, so you have to go back to Freddy and you even to the 70s in order to sort of explain who Wes Craven is, and then the same is true of Halloween and John Carpenter, and there's this whole sense that there is this continuum with, Romero turns up multiple times during the book as well. There are these grand masters of horror, if you like, who I guess if there's another subplot to your book, it's how those guys are sort of overtaken and superseded by new voices.
Absolutely. And you're 100% correct to say that it's a continuum. I mean, it would be an easier story to write if Scream had been written by Kevin Williamson and then, directed by, I'm just trying to think, Robert Rodriguez, Robert Rodriguez approached by Dimension to direct Scream because Wes Craven originally didn't want to do it. And actually, they then approached a whole load of people, supposedly, including Danny Boyle and Robert Rodriguez, and it would have been much, yeah, it would have been much easier because you could have then said this is a new kind of movie and new people making it. As it happened, Wes Craven directed it and directed it brilliantly. And so yes, you have to go back to where did Wes Craven come from? And similarly, although I think it's not rude to say that John Carpenter's best films, he had made his best films or most best films by the time my book starts. Clearly, his films informed a lot of what was to come. And ironically, Scream, although it's directed by Wes Craven, is sort of a riff on Halloween, on John Carpenter's Halloween more than anything else. So you kind of have to explain, who John Carpenter is in hopefully not too boring and familiar a fashion. And yes, as you say, a lot of the book is about these new filmmakers like, Kevin Williamson, like particularly Eli Roth, Scott Derrickson, James Wan, Lee Wanell, who goes from screenwriter to director. But it also, does track the careers of, directors who, as I said, perhaps their best work is behind them, like John Carpenter, like Stuart Gordon. But the great thing is that a lot of those directors got to have kind of a last hurrah or, a near to last hurrah with the of Horror TV show, which Mick Garris executive produced and really was, a showcase for a lot of these filmmakers like, Joe Dante, Stuart Gordon, Toby Hooper, and particularly John Carpenter. So it's not just sort of covering the sort of just tidying up where these directors landed up after major studios stopped being willing to take bets on them.
The thing that I also impressed when reading through your book is that there's always this sense that horror movies, I mean, we talk about this quite a lot, just generally in movies, in the industry generally, is that there seems to be a lack of original storytelling, that everything is based on pre-existing IP. And horror movies kind of also have that written into its history, and using IP in a way which is extremely flexible, so you can have, Abbott and Costello meeting various monsters if need be. Uh, and yet there's always this brand new idea that doesn't have to have a good actor, doesn't have to have a name actor, doesn't have to have a name director, but just the idea alone will sell it. And so, I mean, I can't think of a better example of this happening than the Blair Witch Project.
No, absolutely. I mean, the Blair Witch Project seemed to come out from absolutely nowhere. I mean, one of the sort of joys of the book was that 1999 is, now looked on as this, absolutely amazing year for horror. There's a terrific book called what's it called? Best Movie Year Ever.
Yeah.
And that, to be fair, does cover, that covers The Mummy, which I cover. It covers the Blair Witch Project and The Sixth Sense. But that really was a year where, a lot of people got the opportunity to, um, to show off their skills with these kind of fresh ideas. M. Night Shyamalan with The Sixth Sense. The Mummy kind of reinvigorated. Well, I guess it didn't really reinvigorate the unit. It reinvigorated the Mummy part of the Universal monsters. And as you say, the Blair Witch Project. What I find fascinating in retrospect about the Blair Witch Project, and one of the reasons that I stopped the book in 2013 is that I did a cover story on The Crown. This may seem off topic, but I did a cover story weekly about The Crown, and this was sort of midway through its run, and I interviewed Peter Morgan, who's the creator and the sort of head writer of The Crown. And I was like, well, when do you end this? Like, at what point? Because it wasn't clear then what point in the chronology of the royal family it was going to end. And he said he was going to end it about 10 or 12 years before the current day. And I know at the end, spoiler alert, but at the end of The Crown, the Queen does die. So there is a bit of, it is sort of clearly implied that she will die. But basically, that he fulfilled that promise that it kind of ends 10 or I can't remember exactly when, but 10 or 12 years before the last episode was screened. And he said that anything before 12 years ago, he felt was history. And the most recent 12 years, if you write about that, it's journalism. And I wasn't quite sure what he meant, but I think I'd learned what he meant in the context of writing this book. That certainly one of the things he meant was that it's easier to see history when it's, more than 10 years ago. And so when I was writing this, I mean, if you ask me about what's going on in horror now, I think my answer would be, I don't know. It just seems to be a lot of movies coming out and making money. In 15 years' time, I think you will look back at a film like Sinners and you will think, and you might say, well, that was just a one-off, or that's part of some, broader trend that is not apparent to us right now. And so I couldn't tell you what the state of horror is right now, other than it's very successful. But if you look back to the late 90s or the 2000s, I think a lot of this stuff is quite apparent. And what's amazing about Blair Witch is that it was essentially, I mean, there had been found footage movies before, but essentially it was the first found footage movie blockbuster. And it cost no money. It was a micro-budgeted film, made an absolute fortune around the world. And so, but then what the producers thought was, well, we'll do a sequel. But that won't be found footage because found footage is a one-off and no one will ever want to see a found footage horror movie ever again. That would be crazy. We've got lightning in a bottle, and we're not going to try to stuff lightning in a different bottle, even if it's the same lightning. I'm really making a mess of that metaphor. But anyway, so the second Blair Witch horror movie is a much more, I mean, it is a meta horror movie. It does refer to the first film, but it's a much more traditional and, for the most part, not found footage horror movie, which actually turned a profit, I believe, but, was in no way as successful as the original Blair Witch Project. And so the whole found footage project, the idea of making found footage movies, I mean, you can't even say it was abandoned because it was never picked up in the first place. It was just the Blair Witch Project was regarded as this unrepeatable one-off film until, 6 or 7 years later, when now admittedly, everybody's got almost increasingly, everybody's got a camera, a film camera in their pocket, essentially. But, George Romero does a Diary of the Dead. There's Cloverfield. Paranormal Activity particularly, and suddenly the whole horror scene is awash with found footage horror movies, and it's fascinating. One of the things looking back is it's fascinating to note the trends, but it's also fascinating to note the trends that kind of had, in particular in this case, they had like a false start, and then 6 or 7 years later, everybody was like, "Huh." I don't know. I mean, people saw the Blair Witch Project. Maybe we should try to do that again.
Yeah, and the Spanish film Wreck, which you talk about in your book, I remember being particularly terrifying. And I think they continued. I think Wreck and Wreck 2 are almost a continuous story. And then Wreck
Yeah.
3, they sort of start as found footage, and then halfway through, they sort of drop found footage, and it becomes like more of a normal um, horror movie. Um, I Paranormal Activity and Blair Witch. I remember. I think I wrote something for Electric Sheep about this, or maybe it was for a book. I can't remember. It was a long time ago. But I remember looking at it and thinking how one of them is about going out into the woods, and the other one is about like essentially a haunted house. It's an urban domestic horror, um, and how Paranormal Activity went on to have what, 5 spin-offs, I think.
Well, this is what I have to say. You'd think I would know, but there comes a point where I'll almost have dreams where all these franchises and numbers are dancing about in my head. That sounds about right. I remember I was working at Entertainment Weekly when, or before Paranormal Activity came out, and for those that don't know, this was a film that was kicking around for a couple of years before. I mean, not kicking around, but Jason Blum. This was a film that essentially launched Jason Blum as a horror producer, and he didn't produce the film in the sense that he was on set or anything. It was finished by the time uh, he sort of joined the project, and then he spent an awful long time trying to get a theatrical release for it. Because as I said, people didn't think that those kind of fan footage movies, with exception, people thought that the Blair Witch Project was a one-off, not to be repeated, blah blah blah. And I remember uh, one of our film editors, Missy Schwartz, saying to me that someone from Paramount had called her and said, "Could you come and see this film as a favor to
Mm.
Paramount?" Which is not something that studios. I've never sort of heard that sort of before. That's an odd thing to be asked. And I'm like, sure, I'll come. I mean, see a horror movie during work hours, fantastic. So Missy and I went, and I remember the first 40 minutes of watching Paranormal Activity thinking, is this like is this like a college project by one of the Paramount executives' kids or whatever? Because it just seemed like not a movie. And I was like, I'm gonna write a letter to these to these people complaining they dragged me well, not dragged me, but they wasted my time seeing this film. And then, of course, in the second half, you get more and more involved with it, and by the end, it's a real scare machine. So actually, it worked exactly as it should have done in that instance. But yeah, it was fun because I mean, I'm calling out Hollywood, I guess, for not recognizing the found footage. The found footage could become a phenomenon. But certainly, I was sitting there watching, in 2008 or whatever, 2009, watching Paranormal Activities, and for half an hour thinking, I cannot believe that they've asked me to watch this film.
I mean, isn't there? I was thinking about this when I was reading your chapter on Saw as well. Isn't there like a strange thing that there's this huge disconnect between guys in suits and producers in suits, execs sitting down and watching something and trying to second guess what essentially the kids are going to like, and the kid in the most disreputable way possible, and so um I mean, I was kind of surprised when you had that chapter in Saw, and you had one of the producers sort of going, "Oh yeah, this is it. This is a big movie. This is going to blow our minds," because that's quite because that's somebody who really has keyed on. This is going to be a date movie because they're going to be grabbing at each other, and this is going to be a movie that the next day in high school the kids are going to be talking to each other about, and that'll create word of mouth and everything like that. And it seems like those two worlds are quite far apart, Hollywood making decision makers and the vast number of horror fans who are going and doing and buying tickets.
I think that's true. I mean, Saw is a fascinating story. And Saw was released by Lionsgate, which was like a new company, which was established in the mid 90s by a Canadian businessman who just, from what I mean, he was a big film fan. He woke up one day and he's like, Canada's going to have a major studio, just like Paramount and Warner's. And although it was actually largely based in Lionsgate, pretty soon was pretty much based in Los Angeles. But he was like, great, we're going to release all sorts of films. We're going to make all sorts of films. And now, of course, people know Lionsgate principally as, I guess, the studio that makes John Wick movies, as well as a lot of other films. But the sort of early releases, I mean, they're a new studio, so they're underfunded, really, certainly compared to the Hollywood majors. And so they're scrabbling around. They're getting, this, and then they're releasing dramas and sort of indie comedies and this and that. And they do release a couple of sort of horror films. They release in 2000 American Psycho, which I guess you could call a horror film. And indeed, I write about it in my book. And then this great underseen movie called Frailty, starring Bill Paxton and Matthew McConaughey. But they're not really in the horror business, but they're not really in any business. Monsters, they have Monsters Ball, which wins an Oscar for Halle Berry. But they don't I mean, I interviewed a lot of people at Lionsgate, and they all made clear pretty much that they thought it was a miracle that the company, that the company still existed. When they went away for the weekend, they were always half expecting the company not be there when they came back, and then they get their hands on, they buy Saw, and Saw was this tiny little movie made for $1 million, written by Lee Winnell, directed by James Wan, these two Australians who'd come to Hollywood and struck a deal with this new company called Twisted Pictures. And I mean, for those unfamiliar with the first film, it's very different from the movies, the sequels. There's a lot less kind of gruesomeness and torture in it. Yes, someone does cut off their foot with a hacksaw at the end of the movie, and yes, you will believe that it's on screen, but it is actually not on screen. I mean, it's much more of a James Wan. I mean, they kind of planned it as a Hitchcockian thriller, and in many ways it is. But I mean, it's interesting because yes, you're right. It's easy to say, well, these creative people know what they're doing, and the suits don't. But actually, James and Lee, when they made Saw, I mean, they were thrilled at the idea that possibly it would be released straight to video, essentially. They were like, that's what would have made them happy. That we've made this movie for $1 million with, some sort of stars. I mean, no offense to Danny Glover and Carrie Elwes, but, these aren't huge box office names. And they're largely only in the movie because they were managed by the people that ran Twisted Pictures. So they finished this film. And they're thinking maybe it'll be released in some cinemas, but it's basically a straight to video play. And then some of the executives start seeing it, and they're like, holy crap, this could really, really work. And you've got to look at it from their point of view. And then they, a lot of people at Lionsgate were not in favor of releasing it wide, and they insisted on screen tests. And the screen test they had scored very highly, and then they accused the producers at Twisted Pictures of filling the screen test with people that they knew. And so they did another screen test in Las Vegas, which scored even higher. And eventually they sort of agreed to give it I mean, it's interesting because there were definitely executives at the company that were like, this could be big. And there are other executives that just had a great sort of distaste, I think, for the idea of, this kind of low budget horror movie. And it probably wasn't what they, it wasn't a film that they would have been proud to talk about at a dinner party. This was very much a low budget film, and then they release it, and it becomes a huge, huge hit. And the second film, Saw 2, is an even bigger hit, and I think Saw 3 is an even bigger hit than that. And then they also have Eli Roth's Cabin Fever. They distribute Eli Roth's Hostel. They have the Rob Zombie movies, House of a Thousand Corpses, and The Devil's Rejects. And so suddenly, this company, which the people that made the company imagined, would probably become well known for dramas and comedies, it's suddenly very much in the horror business, almost accidentally. I mean, I say accidentally, but also because certain executives knew that you could always turn a profit on horror. I mean, not as big a profit as they were able to, they didn't imagine they'd be turning this much profit on it. And if you look at the sort of, the articles about Lionsgate from in financial magazines from the time, it's all like either Tyler Perry movies or what came to be known as torture porn movies. It's like Lionsgate's exploding, but because of these two types of films, which had not been in anybody's diary, as they say these days, when the company had been set up.
It is. I mean, it's kind of coming back to that prestige idea as well. There is this thing about horror that, I mean, I remember arguing on the internet that almost every other genre, perhaps with the exception of porn, everybody likes every genre. You like comedies, you like drama, maybe fantasy, science fiction, or war. You're not so hot or cold about, but you'll give them all a try. But horror is one of those things. If you don't like being scared, if you don't like going on a roller coaster, you're not going to watch it. And it doesn't matter if it's a good horror or bad horror. In fact, if it's a good horror, it might be worse than if it's a bad horror for you. So in a sense, it does have that element of already sort of becoming a fraction of an audience rather than everybody. And yet that fraction of the audience is hugely loyal.
Well, it's hugely loyal, and also, as it turns out, it's huge. I mean, it is. The question that people are always asked is, people who write this kind of thing is, well, why do people like horror films? And I guess it's a reasonable question. It's not one that I cover, but it's a question that's only of interest, really, to people who don't like horror films. I mean, it's not something I've ever heard people who are into horror discuss. And it's not something that's covered in my book. And I think, I mean, if you want an answer, I mean, there are many answers. For some people, it is cathartic. For a lot of people, I think it's, a good thing to see on a date. It's interesting because the thing with horror is that it's both can be very original, but also very unoriginal. It's fascinating. There is that dichotomy that people go to see Weapons and then they're like, well, let's make a prequel, which I think they're talking about doing. And I'm much less interested. I mean, I would definitely go and see it. I hope it's great. But I am personally much less interested in franchise continuations. I mean, every time there's a Friday the 13th, people write their list of favorite Friday the 13th films in order, and I just have no interest in that. I like horror because I like being surprised by it, I guess. And also, people seem to think no one ever says, why do you go to a comedy? Because
Right.
people who don't like horror, I think, are like, well, laughing is good and screaming is bad. But I don't really look at it like that. I think they're just the opposite sides of the same coin, that it's fun to have that sort of reaction, whether it's laughter or screaming or being frightened in a controlled environment. And I think that's the main reason why people like horror. So having said I'm not interested in the topic, really, I've now talked about it for 5 minutes.
Well, let me relate it to something else which is in the book, which you do talk about, which I think is it's the sort of political historical context of these years, without sounding too Radio 4. There is a sense that where you have a series of tragedies occurring, primarily the Columbine school shooting and 9/11, then horror commercially takes something of a hit because there's a sense of we don't want to watch kids. Wes Craven says about taking over Scream. I'm not interested in making a film about kids killing kids. And when it comes to 9/11, similarly, there's a sense that we need something which is more uplifting and we don't want to necessarily. So I think that sometimes, as much as I would definitely argue against any sense of, I think it's often a distraction from the core problems, such as gun control or, well, I won't even try to solve the war on terror situation. But I know everybody will be disappointed about that. I'll write a Substack later. But there is a sense that the everybody sort of feels there's some relationship to how we feel about the world and what level we're prepared to enjoy or tolerate a kind of voyeurism that's to do with pain and a voyeurism which is to do with trauma and tragedy. Again, I just want to make it absolutely clear. I'm not knocking horror here. I think you could say the same thing about Titus Andronicus or Hamlet. I'm not, I'm not specifically targeting the genre, but it feels like those things happen in the book.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I decided to cover this time period is that this was really, certainly the 2000s, was a period where I was watching a lot of horror movies and talking to a lot of horror, people. And I don't remember at the time thinking, oh, well, here's like the third horror movie I've seen this year, which pretty explicitly references the Iraq War. But looking back, I was quite stunned by how many films did. I mean, there's this whole theory that the rise of extreme horror in the 2000s was sort of inspired by, or certainly its popularity was inspired by the images that people were seeing on television, that people are seeing real life horrors on television. And so you need to up the ante somewhat in the horror films that people are seeing. And that's a reasonable argument, but I was quite surprised by how many directly reference the Iraq War. And it's interesting because if you look back at a lot of the kind of dramas that deal with the Iraq War, that's their subject, or the war on terror, then a lot of those are kind of unsuccessful films. Whereas horror, of course, can sort of do it incidentally. I mean, if you look at the remake of, or if you look at the second, this goes back to the numbers, but if you go back to the second if you go back to the remake of The Hills of Ice 2, it's about, I mean, it couldn't be clearer. It's about a group of hapless, I believe I recall the National Guardsmen or soldiers of some stripe in the desert being horribly brutalized and murdered by mutants. Now, I'm guessing the financing studio didn't care who was being, as long as people were being murdered, Wes Craven could make those characters whoever he wanted, and thus was able to make them National Guardsmen, and thus make the whole thing an allegory about the Iraq War. But it's interesting how quickly, I mean, the thing about horror is because they could just pivot really quickly. And in a great example of this is Grindhouse. In Robert Rodriguez's half of Grindhouse, Planet Terror, he had written that script in the late 90s, and when they actually came to make the movie, it was post 9/11, and so he has there's a band of soldiers that that contract some awful mutation, and in the finished version, they've just come back. They get get turned into zombies essentially while killing Osama bin Laden fictionally. I mean, he was still alive in the world, and I'm not suggesting that's a fantastic philosophical comment on world affairs by Robert Rodriguez, but in a sort of Roger Corman type fashion, I think horror sort of marks those periods of time in a way much more effectively than any other genre.
Yeah, it's kind of because it speaks to the unconscious as well, and it's that the idea that maybe even if you're not aiming for it, you're better at doing it.
Yeah,
You can sort of ricochet. You sort of kill someone via the ricochet rather than aiming for the head, so to speak.
yeah, absolutely.
So, as we go towards the present, I mean, we've mentioned Eli Roth a few times and the whole torture porn thing, and you're kind of quite focused on American horror, but of course, the French extreme period also comes into this with High Tension, which gets an American release, and the director goes on to then make some American horror films as his career continues. Um, that interplay between, I think that feels to me to be new. Horror has become much more international than or internationally available than it
Yeah.
seemed to be when I was growing up as a kid, 1980s, and getting the VHS from the top shelf of the local Shell garage.
For sure, absolutely. I mean, just the technology allows that. And I mean, this is a book that is centered on the American film industry, uh, because I had neither the knowledge nor the space, or nor the page count to deal with what was going on in France, what was going on in Japan, what was going on in South Korea, what was going on in a half a dozen other locales. Now, I do mention these films, but mostly in the context of how either those films influenced Hollywood, or as you say, filmmakers like Alexandra Aja would then went to make American movies. I mean, but there's nothing. I mean, it's the great thing about foreign horror to me is that you just sense that they're not like they just don't obey the same rules, or even a
Mm,
cognizant of the same rules as Hollywood filmmakers. And part of that is also, I think, often you don't know who these actors are, you don't know literally where you are. So I mean, as I said, what I love about horror is that anything can happen, and I think that's doubly the case from my point of view, in quote unquote foreign movies. The story of High Tension, I didn't know anything about, really. I just remembered High Tension, haute tension, I believe, as the French undoubtedly would complain about my pronunciation of that. But all I knew was that it was a French movie, that its kind of name was more like it had a familiar name, and I had seen the film, but as it wasn't a hit, or really had seemed to be distributed at all, from my memory, I wasn't really sure why people knew about it, frankly. And then when I went into it, uh, when I looked into it, it's just a fascinating story that it was bought again by Lionsgate, and the idea was that it would be one of their sort of like art house releases, and then the chief marketing executive at Lionsgate took the lead actress out to the desert and took these spectacular images of her with like a club with barbed wire, and and then blew up one of those images and stuck it on his wall. And then another executive came in and went, "That's a wide release movie." Now, High Tension is a great film, but it's a great film with a really weird twist that I think, which I won't spoil, but will definitely leave a lot of people thinking, WTF? What on earth
mm.
is going on? And does this mean that everything I've seen before didn't happen, or is nonsense, or whatever? And that's one of the reasons I think it's a fascinating film. But it's not necessarily a film to which people in thousands of multiplexes across America will warm. And so it was a rare kind of big genre flop for Lionsgate, because they put it out as a wide release, America said no, thank you to high. And so it then just disappeared from screens. Whereas, I think they now admit that if they'd put it out as an art house film essentially, and then maybe platformed it a bit, then it would have been much more successful. I mean, I have to say the great thing about looking at these movies is I think like to the non-horror fan, people are just like, all these films are the same. And they're not the same, but also their backstories have so many similarities. And one of the thrills of this book is sort of almost subliminally pointing out the same thing happening again and again. It's some people with a dream and very little money making a very cheap movie that then becomes a huge success and inspires 17 sequels. But they are like snowflakes. And I don't mean snowflakes in the way that it's used nowadays, but in the sense that each snowflake is different. And each of these stories and each of these filmmakers, while often from a distance following similar trajectories, all of their stories are slightly different. And I really, it's just fascinating to dig into. I mean, there are some films that I wrote quite a lot about in the book that I never dreamed that I would be even mentioning in this book, like for example, Dracula 2000, which a sort of attempt by Dimension, which was a sort of sister company of Miramax, to cash in on their post-Scream success with a Dracula movie. And I interviewed the director, Patrick Lussier, and I was principally I mean, he's a recurring character in the book, worked on a lot of different films. But I was interviewing principally because he was Wes Craven's longtime editor, worked on the Scream films, and I kind of wanted his reminiscences about that, which I got. But then he started talking about, I mean, I asked him, but he started talking about Dracula 2000 and how I think it was his second film as a director, and Bob Weinstein basically said, we want to do a Dracula movie. We're going to call it Dracula 2000. And Patrick was like, well, all right, what else have you got? And Bob Weinstein was like, that's it, basically. The other thing is it has to be out in 9 months. This was at the start of 2000, I guess. Or was it called Yes, the start of 2000. It had to be out before the end of the year. And so it just became this absolute nightmare for Patrick where, he writes a script, co-writes a script, and then as usually happened with the Weinsteins, it gets rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. But he's like very conscious that he's going to finish this film by the end of the year, and this is and it's still being rewritten. It just becomes the whole nightmare. Although what was interesting, so the interesting coda about that is in some countries it was released the following year, where it was called Dracula 2001, and you think, well, really, they could have just phoned this till like there wasn't anything particularly time sensitive about this. I mean, there's I cover mostly forgotten Arnold Schwarzenegger film called End of Days, which is kind of a science fiction horror movie about Gabriel Byrne plays the devil and he has to impregnate somebody before the end of 1999, before the end of the millennium, and that was a race to finish the film. But at least that is trying to cash in on the end of the millennium fears, whereas Dracula 2000 kind of didn't have anything to do with the year, really. And you do think, in retrospect, although I forgot to point this out to Patrick, he probably does not need me pointing it out to him, that really they could have phoned it the following summer and it wouldn't have been such a hassle.
Yeah, I mean, I do like one of the best Dracula titles is Dracula 1972, but yeah, Dracula, Dracula 2000 isn't necessarily that different from 2001 because you've got a film called 2001 already there as well, so you can have it can feel like it's in dialogue with that. So as we go into the present, and as you say, the last part of your book, you're talking about the 10 years leading up to this. We've had Blumhouse, we have Netflix with Lee Whannell doing these great adaptations of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House and Bly Manor and Edgar Allan Poe, Fall of the House of Usher, which I really liked. I think that was my favorite of the of those Netflix shows so far. Um, and it just feels like there are those real established names. Jordan Peele as well has sort of established himself very firmly as a horror director, and yet every year throws up a new visionary or a new pair of directors. In the case of the Australian brothers who have done Speak to Me, and they've got a new film come that's already out. I think I forget the name of the brothers though. You'll know, won't you, Clark?
It's the Philippou brothers.
There you
Again,
go.
I'm sure I'm butchering that name, but yes.
Well, yeah, I didn't even have the name there to butcher. I'm afraid.
No, absolutely. And yeah, there does seem to be. I should just point out so that people don't write in, that you said that Lee Whannell did the Shirley Jackson adaptation. It's actually Mike Flanagan.
Oh God,
But
yes.
yes,
Oh,
Mike Flanagan.
Lee Whannell
It's
did The Invisible Man,
another.
and yeah.
Yeah, Lee did the Invisible Man, and then Wolfman earlier this year. I mean, I mean, I knew it was going to start with Scream, and that's not an original idea. I mean, I think most people do, recognize that Scream kicked off a whole new, wave of horror. My problem really with the book was was when to end it, to be
Mm.
honest. I think I made the right decision with The Conjuring, because that was the first horror franchise that begat the first horror franchise to be a $2 billion horror franchise. But it could have stopped elsewhere. But also, I mean, in addition to the fact, frankly, that Screaming and Conjuring seemed like a pretty good title. Um, After 2013, and again, as you say, everything is a continuum, but you do have a lot of new voices making um, what seemed to me to be slightly different types of horror movies. And I'm not just saying this because I know you're very familiar with the director, but what's interesting is that shortly after The Conjuring, you have um, Under the Skin by Jonathan Glazer. Now I mean, is that a horror movie? I don't know, but it's certainly like a film I would have felt obliged to cover. I think if I'd ended this in 2015. But I think Under the Skin sort of signpost to a certain type of, like, I mean, that was released by A24, I believe, and that's it was one of the first A24 movies, and that kind of is a signpost towards Hereditary, towards The Witch, towards a lot of films that I guess have been described as like trauma horror. Um,
I thought you were going to
and
say elevated horror there.
I don't use the term elevated horror. That's just but I mean, you can use the term elevated horror. It's just something that
You
I
try to
know is
avoid.
such a is such. I mean, for those that don't know, elevated horror is a phrase that's sort of applied to, I don't know what you describe it. Horror with, I don't want to say pretensions, but horror that's more than just a bunch of kids being butchered by somebody in a mask. Um, but it's a real people get very aggravated when you use the term elevated horror, and also, like, I mean, whole, people have been making elevated horror for. I mean, what's Frankenstein? I mean, what's
Mm.
Dracula really? I mean, certainly dealing in themes that are more than just people being killed. But I did feel and Jordan Peele, of course, also that Jordan Peele is a film, a very fresh, uh, or was, and I'm not saying he isn't anymore, but it was a very fresh voice, and now, and it just seemed. I don't want to say that, because as you say, it's a continuum, so I don't want to say these films are really so different from what's come before necessarily. Um, but that did seem like a whole other chapter, and by chapter I probably mean 7 chapters that would have taken me uh, in the book, and so while those would have been fascinating to cover, and I've talked to a lot of the people that made those movies, you could that's a whole other book, frankly, or a much expanded version of a book. I mean, the most terrifying thing about this book is it's 150,000 words, and what I've discovered is it's very hard to stuff them into padded envelopes. I've been sending copies of the book off to people who are good enough to talk to me, like Neil Marshall, the director of The Descent, and Corin Hardy, the director of The Nun, and it's fun. And so if you sort of, if you pass me in a post office over the past couple of weeks, you see me desperately trying to shove a large book into a small padded envelope. So yeah, I had to kind of pull up the drawbridge somewhere, and The Conjuring seemed like a good place to do it. I mean, The Conjuring was not it's not revolutionary. I mean, it's a brilliantly made film, but it's not revolutionary in the way that Scream was revolutionary, other than I have to say it really proved that a pure horror movie without a star name could could become a huge hit in America during the summer months, which hadn't happened in quite a long time. But what came after that seemed very different, while also over the past 10 years, frankly, you've had a lot of the franchises which began during the period that my book covers, either continuing or, rebooting, to use that odious phrase. So um, you've had the return of the Scream franchise, as we said, 28 years later, Final Destination, and so on.
Yeah, and even Halloween has had a new trilogy in.
Halloween.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think of the
Oh,
Terrifier films? Because they feel like something. I was going to say they feel like something of an outlier, but then In a Violent Nature also sort of does that extreme gore and is very much based on its kills. But yeah, Terrifier seems to be selling the gore as the main point.
funnily enough, well, yes, that's absolutely right, and that does seem like a throwback to the very much to the 1980s when it's all about the kills, and it's quite refreshing in that way. I'm just sort of grinning because um, Lincoln Center in New York is a very fancy um, art center. I mean, calling it an art center doesn't really do it justice, and it's the kind of it's where the New York Film Festival is hosted essentially, and you have very fancy premieres there. But around this time every year, they have like a little horror film festival, essentially, where they show new horror movies. And so I saw the first Terrifier at Lincoln Center in New York, which was an extraordinarily sort of swanky place to watch a film which is built around people being absolutely horribly murdered for no point. I mean, and I don't mean that as a criticism, but as I say, it's harkening back to the 80s when it's sort of like random mayhem. So I've always had a soft spot for it. And again, I mean, I mean, that's just the great thing about horror, that it can sort of shake, you can get these tiny movies that then become absolute box office hits. I mean, I mean, you look at romantic comedies, and I remember I was working in Entertainment Weekly when My Big Fat Greek Wedding became a hit. And that was such a huge story, that this tiny little romantic comedy had become, the most popular film in America, essentially. But I feel like horror does that every couple of years. You know what I mean? That some maniac will make a movie with his friends that then becomes. I mean, Terrifier wasn't that big a hit, but Terrifier 2 certainly wasn't. Terrifier 3 was enormous, and it's impossible really to imagine any other genre where where that could happen. And I mean, it's not necessarily my. Although I remember interviewing the director of Terrifier for the second movie when people were like vomiting in the story had got around that people were fainting and vomiting, and I interviewed him, and he couldn't have been nicer. As indeed pretty much everybody in horror is delightful, to be honest with you, which I hope sort of subliminally comes across in the book as well, with some notable exceptions. um yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily watch horror movies for the kills, but I think this is also clear in the book that this isn't a book where I am judging these films.
Right,
This isn't
right.
a book like I'm not. This is not a book of people must be. I mean, given that I don't discuss why people like horror or offer critical assessments of the movies, people must wonder what on earth this book is about. But it's about how these films come, sort of happened. But yeah, it's not real. It's just I didn't want it to be a book where I expressed my own personal opinion about these films, most of which I saw like in office hours and was for free, or certainly, I could expense the ticket. So I was always happy watching all of these films for the most part. You know what I mean? I'm like, this is great. This is great. But I obviously rewatched a lot of these films um, when I was writing the book, and I was surprised by how many, and indeed, pretty much all of them stood up.
Yeah.
I remember rewatching The Descent. I mentioned Neil Marshall earlier, with my girlfriend who hadn't seen the film, but we were watching it. We were watching it on the computer that I'm speaking to you on now, which is like, a totally run-of-the-mill Mac PowerBook whose screen could do with a clean, to be honest with you. I mean, if Neil Marshall had seen the conditions under which I was watching his horror masterpiece, I'm sure he would have been horrified. But there was a point in that film when we both literally jumped from the sofa to an almost standing position in absolute shock and horror. And not that it's just a film about jump scares. It's about a lot of things. It's just a great movie. But yeah, I was surprised, maybe not surprised, but I was certainly pleased how many of the films from the era 100% stood up.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, if you allow me, and I hope this is a description that does justice to your book, but if people want to know what type of book your book is, it felt to me like a sort of raging Bull's Easy Rider for the horror world of that period, so that you feel how those productions affect each other, affect the world, how the people making these films get them made, the behind the scenes feel, and ultimately the sort of reception and the success or otherwise of the films as well, and a real sense of the personalities involved. So, in that sense, I felt it's a really entertaining read. It's really um, difficult to put down. You're constantly turning pages, and if you're like me and you have a passion for horror, um then it's so great to sort of see behind the scenes for these films that you kind of know on a very on a I was going to say superficial basis, because it's not superficial you watching the movie, but you know it from watching the movie. You don't know what went into to the actual development and the creation of these films.
Yeah, well, that was. I mean, certainly, I was thinking about Raging Bulls, Easy Riders. I have to say, there's 99.9% less cocaine usage in my book, which I guess sadly or not sadly, um, mostly because I think the people certainly in their early days could not afford that. Um, but yeah, that was certainly a thought, and I just wanted to. I mean, you talked a little bit about how horror is, not regarded that highly necessarily in Hollywood. And I just wanted to write a book, I guess, that treated the genre in the same way that you would treat, uh, those films from the 70s, or a book about thrillers, or a book about, comedies, or whatever. I think it's sort of my attempt to uh, I mean, I don't want to say I'd give the genre respectability, because there's a lot of pretty, I mean, this book has like 5 pages on the Human Centipede franchise, so I'm not gonna say it's without its sort of disreputable elements, I guess. But no, I think it's just sort of worth. I just wanted to treat it in the same look at as you said, look at the political, the broader world, look at it almost as a business story. And also, uh, I mean, I'm not there. I mean, the horror community is something of a community, both in terms of fans and creators, but also that people, I think it is a genre where people work together in various ways. I mean, one of the sort of great interviewees for the book was Greg Nicotero, who is this legendary makeup effects, special makeup effects artist, and also producer and director. And he's one of the, you know, main creative forces behind The Walking Dead franchise, but also his career stretches back to Evil Dead 2. And I had him on. I mean, I've spoken to him before. He's a lovely gentleman, as well as being hugely talented. But I did, a lengthy interview with him, almost just sort of shouting film names at him, and got lots and lots of great quotes, and really couldn't have featured any more quotes from him in the book. But I mean, I must have spoken to him about 12 films, and I could have spoken to him about 12 completely different films that he worked on, because, he has worked on so many. And so it was fun to kind of, when possible, tie this all together. That is helped by the fact that the Masters of Horror, which was first a dinner and then a TV show. I think it's the only dinner that's ever become a TV show. That was sort of an arena where people do hang out with each other. And one of my favorite stories of the book is, I interviewed Darren Bousman, who has directed many movies, but directed Saw 2, Saw 3, Saw 4, and is an absolutely fabulous interviewee. But he talked about going to a Masters of Horror dinner where one of the other diners was Ken Russell, the famed and idiosyncratic English film director of Altered States and Listomania. And I was like, well, what was Ken Russell like? And Bousman said he was, one of the most sort of truculent and difficult individuals he'd ever been in a restaurant with, basically. And then Bousman paused and went, "It was amazing. He's my spirit animal. The idea that I could be like, in the same presence as this sort of very difficult person, sort of amused Darren enormously." And I love that kind of behind the scenes stuff. It kind of amused me. No one's dying to hear, really. I guess no one's dying to hear about Darren Bousman's recollections of having dinner with Ken Russell. But I think in a 400-page book, you can have a paragraph on it.
Absolutely. Was that the sort of dinner that I remember John Carpenter being interviewed a few years ago about going to these dinners and meeting David Cronenberg there, and they were all talking to David Cronenberg about his themes, and Carpenter just went, "Oh, fuck this," and went off. I'm like, I don't do themes.
Yeah, I think that's about. Yes, yes, it's the same dinner. I'd interviewed Carpenter. Because most of the films, Carpenter's films that I cover in the book, as I say, is towards the sort of the end of his career. I tended to speak with other people about working with him rather than Carpenter himself. But I've interviewed him before about. I interviewed him before when the first Halloween film came out. I interviewed him on the Universal lot, and I think because I mentioned that I played the drums early in the conversation, he quite got into that, and or rather, he quite enjoyed that fact. And this is in the book, but he explained to me how he came up with the 5/4 time signature for the Halloween theme, and he can be quite jolly. Well, maybe jolly if pressing it, but if you sort of get him on something he wants to talk about, he is he is good value. But I interviewed the producer Peter Block about about working with Carpenter on his last movie, and Block recalls that Carpenter found out that he was like allergic to cigarette smoke, that Block was allergic to cigarette smoke. And of course, Carpenter's like a chain smoker, basically. And on the second day or whatever of a shoot, Block turned up to find that they built some sort of airtight like cube for him to sit in some distance away from John Carpenter. And this was where Peter Block was supposed to like, almost like a boy in the bubble situation where he was supposed to sit. But he said, because he was such a fan of Carpenter, he said, it was like going to see a concert and your favorite rock star spitting on you, basically. And people would be like, oh, it's disgusting. And Peter Block was like, no, that would be amazing. So, he said he was very happy with the situation.
I had my headphones on when I was reading that part of the book when you talked about the Halloween theme tune, and so I put it on immediately.
Right.
And dun, 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 this final question then, Clark. Can we have a recommended film book from you?
Well, I didn't listen back to our previous conversation, so I'm worried that I'm just going to say the same books again. I will say that recently I read the Craig Wasson book about Coppola, which I thought was just it's well written, but just from a research point of view, was absolutely amazing. And I had also read Erotic Vagrancy, the Richard Burton and Liz Taylor book by, is it Roger Lewis? One of your,
Yes.
And I have to say, it's a crazy book. It's a huge book, and Roger injects himself a lot into the book, and I'd be lying if I didn't say that my eyebrow was raised when that occurred, as it often does throughout the book. But it's just still an extraordinary point. It's an extraordinarily brilliant piece of work. The two books, and I have a horrible suspicion I did recommend these last time, but let's see. The book that, even more than Easy Riders, the book that was sort of my guiding light with writing Screaming and Conjuring was City of Nets by Otto Friedrich, which is a history of Los Angeles during the 1940s, and sort of, it's like this is going to sound pretentious, but it's a real tapestry. So you have 5 pages on Errol Flynn, and then 5 pages on Alfred Hitchcock, and 5 pages on something else. And but you get a real sense of that period. And I should point out that my book is much worse than that. I mean, that was just it was an inspiration in which I signally did not manage to match the inspiration. But my favorite book about movies, which I really think is the best book about movies ever written, is Stephen Back's The Final Cut. Stephen Back was BACH was a executive at MGM UA, one of the people responsible, essentially, one of the producers, one of the executives responsible for Heaven's Gate, Michael Cimino's film, and it traces the entire production and then the disastrous release. And it's just fantastic. And it's the only example, really, of someone inside the making of something like that who's such a good writer and managed to write such a great book about it. And if you've ever wondered how a film that was originally budgeted at, I don't know, $3 million wound up costing 44, then he walks you through it. And it is like every chapter. I mean, a lot of people like Heaven's Gate, that's fine. In many ways, it is an incredible piece of work, but you're just at every step of the way just screaming, pull the plug, just pull the plug on this thing. There's always, and he just walks you through why they didn't, with like just an incredible sense of regret every single chapter. And it is quite amazing. And my favorite, sorry that this is going on, but my favorite, and I'm going to misremember the details, but Cimino doesn't show them the film essentially. But one of the cards they have is, I think it has to be under 2 hours long. And they eventually let him see, Cimino eventually lets the United Artists executives see the film at a screening. And he introduces it and says, don't worry, look, I know it's 10 minutes long, But we can cut that, no worries. But essentially, this is the movie, and I think the chapter ends with something like, and then we sat and watched Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate, all 4 hours and 47 minutes of it, and it's just like, oh my God, it's just astonishing. And then actually, the next chapter begins with like people saying, "Was it just me, or could you not hear the dialogue?" Which is spectacular too. But that's. Yeah, I've got a tearing up thing. I tear up about odd things, but that's a great book.
Oh,
I've certainly
wonderful.
read that book many more times than I've watched Heaven's Gate, which makes me feel bad, but there you go.
I love I think there's only one thing better than a triumph, and it's a disaster.
Yeah,
It just makes
and you feel bad. You feel bad but it's true. But I feel you could watch the triumphs and then read about the disasters. I think that's a
yeah, that's a
good.
good combination.
Yeah,
Definitely.
sorry, I know I'm going on, but writing about the werewolf film Cursed in my book was so much fun because that
Mm.
was a similar tale of like a small werewolf movie that careered wildly out of control and ended up costing it. I mean, it's one of the most expensive horror movies ever made, and no one even remembers it at this point. I think it's fair to
Yeah,
say.
I read those pages thinking, well, have I seen that? I don't even think I've heard of it. There was
Oh, I
also
watched it. Sorry, go
also
on.
the Mike Nichols film Wolf. I remember watching that and reading Mark Harris's biography of Nichols, and it says they they didn't have enough footage really for the film, and so they just used slow motion at the end to extend the end of the film.
Well, Mark, I mean, I had the pleasure of working with Mark for a few years. And yeah, I mean, I'm not saying anything new to say that that is an absolutely astounding book, but and it's not but except that this is sort of what we're talking about, and I think reflects poorly on me. But the parts I reread, I do not reread like how he made The Graduate, but I do reread how he made like The Day of the Dolphin
Yes.
and Catch 22. It's called The Day of the Dolphin. Is that the one with
Yeah,
where they
that's
get
the
the
one.
or
Yeah,
whatever?
he's training
I am much
dolphins to kill the
more
president.
I am much more entertained by the stories of. I mean, and actually talking about Mark Harris, his book Pictures of the Revolution, is that what it's
Yeah.
called? Which is another genius piece of work, which is about four amazing movies, and then it's about the. I'm sure everybody knows this, but it's about the five films that were nominated for the Best Picture uh, in one particular year, and it's four fantastic movies, and then Doctor Dolittle, and the Doctor Dolittle chapters are definitely the ones that I tend to reread.
Gravitate
Maybe
towards.
I'm just a terrible person, but there are many. I write about many fantastic movies in my book, and some not so great.
Excellent. So the book is Screaming and Conjuring: The Resurrection and Unstoppable Rise of the Modern Horror Movie by Clark Collis. And that was brilliant. Thank you so much for talking to me, Clark.
Thank you. To be honest, this is the first one of these I've done. So I hope I didn't just yammer on too much.
I'd rather yammer on with you than talk lucidly and shortly with someone else. So
Good.
no, I loved it. I loved it. Thank you, Clark.
Okay.
So
All
I'm
right.